Hey everybody, long time no see. I did not make a September video, and there were two reasons for this. First and foremost, that I was traveling in Italy, and la vita is quite dolce there, and I really was in a different headspace, and for the first time in almost a year and a half, I really wasn't thinking about travel restrictions in Japan or elsewhere. Second reason, of course, is that nothing really happened in the month of September. There were a few notable news headlines. Keidaren, of course, made their official recommendation in the early part of the month for Japan to eliminate quarantine for vaccinated travelers. And then, of course, we knew that Suga was going to resign and that a new prime minister and administration was going to take over. But essentially nothing big happened on the hashtag Japan travel ban front during the month of September. And it's interesting because, of course, last Friday was October 1st, and I was going to make a video then. And then I thought, I remembered back to 2020 when the press announcement about the global residence track and the business track ended up taking place on a Friday night. It was actually the last Friday in September of 2020, and I thought, no, I should wait. And then I waited until later this morning, so I'm in the United States right now, so the business day is long since over by Japan. I waited until late this morning, America time, because I heard that the new Prime Minister, Kishida, was going to do a press conference at 9 p.m. Japan time. So I guess I'll start with the bad news, which is that in spite of my having waited, and in spite of the fact that we're now 4 or 5 days into October, depending on where you are when you watch this, nothing concrete has happened. And I say concrete because I think there are some indicators and indications that if there is not actual movement on the horizon, there is at least momentum in the minds and hearts of certain people that could make things happen. But at the end of the day, nothing has really happened. In his 9 p.m. press conference that just completed, I didn't watch it, for fair warning, because I just can't be bothered to listen to this bullshit any Japanese politician says anymore. But I spoke to people on Twitter, and they did not mention the border situation once, okay? I guess he did make some veiled reference to getting back to normal economic activity, but I don't think that at this point, 18 months after the border closed, we owe Japan or Japanese politicians the benefit of the doubt of needing to read positive and affirmative things into the generic politician statements they make. Now, on the other hand, I do think that there are reasons to be hopeful. I mean, obviously, the first reason is that Japan's vaccination rate continues to increase rapidly. I think they are now at 60% fully vaccinated, which puts them on target to reach their 70% fully vaccinated, assuming things continue at pace, before the November 1st, or maybe even might have been November 30th deadline that Suga had set when he was still in office. I think obviously that's a good thing because the more people that are vaccinated, and when you combine that with the substantial natural immunity Japan has built up, the less rational incentive there is to continue any sort of restrictions. Now, of course, this process has not been rational, neither in Japan nor anywhere else, but that does give me hope. I think the fact that Kishida seems really intent on getting things done, even if he hasn't specifically mentioned the border. The fact that he has called the snap election for October 31st instead of waiting until November 7th or November 14th, like most people assumed he would do, I think that's a good sign. Now, I think we need to be cautious in interpreting that in a positive way, because it could just be that he's wanting to do the election before the next surge of COVID happens, even though I think due to vaccinations, it won't be nearly as severe in terms of severe illness and death. But that could be the cynical reading of that he wants to get the election taken care of before COVID has a chance to really come back in earnest. But it's very clear that he has a little bit more pep in his step as a general rule than Suga did. And I think that probably bodes well for the border. I think that it's good news, of course, that last month Keidaren spoke up and said that they need to get rid of the quarantine. I don't necessarily think it's good news that they reduced the 14-day quarantine, which most Japanese people, not most, but a good number of Japanese people don't strictly obey, to 10 days if you have a negative PCR test on day 10, and if you're fully vaccinated. I think they were just humoring Keidaren, which is not to say there isn't some greater easing in the pipeline at some point, but I didn't really get excited about that. And I got really fucking annoyed when CNN, one of their morons, posted an article saying, oh yeah, Japan eases quarantine restrictions to 10 days, and made no mention of the fact that all new entry foreigners are banned, and probably misled and got a lot of people excited, including some people who know better, and you know who you are if you're watching this. So that I don't think on its own is good. But one other thing that didn't get a lot of media attention that I think is notable is the president and CEO of ANA actually spoke up the other day and was very vocal about the fact that the only way the aviation industry in Japan, or the travel industry more broadly, is going to recover is with a substantial international recovery. And now, if you wanted to be cynical reading that, you could say, well, maybe he was talking about transit flights, which are of course already increasing due to easing restrictions in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. Maybe he's talking about eased restrictions for Japanese people only, which, he could be, who knows. But I think that my reading of this is that most of the travel industry players in Japan have been really quiet throughout this. They've been silent, in fact, and it's infuriated me. The fact that they are being this forceful and explicit in public makes me wonder what's being said behind the scenes. To say nothing of the fact that, Keidanren made their official recommendation in public on September 13th or whatever it was. They haven't stopped behind the scenes. I don't think that for 1 second. So I do think probably the reality is that there is some sort of discussion and planning, and there may in fact already be a loose plan in place behind the scenes. I think what frustrates a lot of us, particularly those of us who come from Western democratic countries where essentially the entire process of government and governance is out in the open and transparent, is that Japan has been completely untransparent this entire time. And I think that when you add to that the fact that most of the Japanese government seems apathetic to our struggle. And then there was a Nikkei article last week where basically the foreign ministry gave one quote and they said, the total entry ban will stay in effect. I think it creates what they call, I watch a lot of self-help videos on YouTube, and I watched this one girl, and I don't remember the name of the channel. I might put it in the description, I might not. But anyway, she talks about this concept of cognitive distortion, where basically our brain tricks us into believing this false thing to be true. And I think the lack of concrete news on the Japan side, you have all this good news elsewhere. Sorry about that. For whatever reason, my phone stopped recording, and I have no idea why it did. I'm gonna have to figure out how to combine these clips in post. But you have all this relatively good news coming in from around the world, and then you have nothing in Japan. And I think the cognitive distortion that happens is that we convince ourselves that this is never going to end, that it's literally never going to end, that Japan is opening entering another sakoku period, and that it's going to be 200 years of closed borders, and that we're all going to be dead by the time Japan opens again. That is not going to happen. Japan is going to open its border again someday to business people, to workers, to students, and then to tourists, eventually without quarantine. And it is almost certainly going to be by the end of next year, and probably in the first part of next year. But the problem is, and this, of course, the blame for this falls squarely on the government of Japan and their incurious media, and I'm sorry to say the fact that a lot of Japanese people are racist and xenophobic, is that there's just no news, there's no political incentive to accelerate any of this, because of course, with the exception of Japanese salarymen who don't care about the restrictions being eased for foreigners, people who work in the tourism industry and international education, of course, the vast majority of Japanese people don't care if a foreign person ever enters their country again. So this isn't politically popular. I think that because, of course, international tourism is very important to Japan's economy. With their shrinking population, having a large base of foreign workers is going to become increasingly important. International education, I think, maybe more in a self-image sense of the country, wanting to become a normal member of the global community more than the economic impact is very important. But I think the unfortunate part is that Japan doesn't have the same impetus as, say, Thailand, where 20% of the GDP is tourism, to open its borders. And so I think when you combine that with what Rochelle Walensky, the director of the CDC, but Japan Intercult on Twitter, she wrote this article last year talking about the psychology of Japanese decision-making and hierarchies and government is part of the reason that none of these plans, in spite of the fact that they almost certainly exist behind closed doors, it's why none of these plans have been publicized and why we don't end up knowing anything until right before it happens. Like for me, my best case scenario right now is that sometime over the next couple of weeks, because it does look like, even though his press conference was really scant on details, I don't think Kishida wants to wait till after the election to start getting shit done, particularly when it comes to getting the Japanese economy back to normal. And, I guess his ultimate goal is to help out the middle class, redistribute wealth, yada, yada, yada. I don't really care about domestic policy. God bless Japan. I wish the best to Japanese people, but this is about border restrictions. I do think that there is a chance that there will be some kind of announcement made within the next couple of weeks. Now, here's what I do think is going to happen. I don't think it's going to be a repeat of last year, right? I don't think it's going to be, safe countries, residence and business track, and then global residence and business track, and then group tourists from China and Taiwan and yada, yada, yada. I don't think it's going to be as staged as it was last year. I think probably what it's going to be is that they're going to say, as of some date, maybe November 1st, and again, I'm just pulling this out of thin air. Nobody told me that. I haven't heard any rumors about it. This is just maybe a gut feeling type thing. Maybe he says, okay, as of November 1st, foreigners with medium long stay visas, regardless of where they come from, if they are vaccinated, they can be subject to the same rules as vaccinated Japanese travelers, which would mean coming in, getting a test at the border, and quarantining for 10 days. Then at the same time, they could announce that, okay, as of January 1st, we are going to eliminate the quarantine for vaccinated travelers, maybe have 10 days of quarantine for travelers without a vaccine. And then if you are vaccinated, you can enter the country for any reason. If you're not vaccinated, you can only come in for an essential reason, which would basically align Japan's border policies with the EU, right? Vaccinated people from any country in the world can enter most EU countries for tourism or any other purpose, whereas only essential travelers who are not vaccinated are allowed to come in. And I think, to me, that would be the best case scenario. And again, this November 1st, January 1st date, I pulled this out of my ass. Like, it doesn't have any bearing in reality. And in fact, on the Japan travel Reddit, someone was speculating that because, I guess Kishida had said off the record that he didn't see the COVID situation stabilizing globally until at least next spring, and the fact that the first quarter of the year in Japan technically begins in April, they had read into that they didn't think there was going to be any movement on the border until next April. But again, that was one off-the-cuff statement. I don't necessarily know that is any bearing on reality. On the other hand, speaking about another cognitive distortion, I think one thing we all need to be really careful about is, like, for example, a lot of things I hear from the tourism side is people saying, oh, well, Japan has to open in March or April because it can't go another cherry blossom season without having foreign tourists. This is very dangerous because, again, that makes sense according to the logic of almost every other place in the world. It does not make sense according to Japanese logic, and I can guarantee that with the exception of innkeepers and other tourism operators and maybe the airlines, no one in Japan is thinking like that. So I think we need to avoid that, because you could just as easily say, for example, why don't they open by December and January for the operators up in Niseko, because of course most of the people who go to Niseko are foreigners. And so I think that's a thought process we should get away from. Likewise for students, obviously the term start dates mean nothing to them because nothing happened before April next year, or this year. So I don't necessarily know that April next year, assuming that things are still in stasis, is going to be a motivator for them. I think that, again, there's some logical decision-making process that's going on behind the scenes, but it evidently doesn't correspond to any of our logic, because if it did, it would have already been resolved. Unfortunately, in spite of the fact that Japan has had almost 2 million confirmed infections and probably between 20 and 50 million actual infections within its border, tens of thousands of people dead, Japan is still pursuing a border policy that's essentially China. It's New Zealand, it's Australia. It's essentially a COVID zero border policy, which places all of the onus for the coronavirus burden the country has borne since April of 2020, I guess March, February, since it's Japan, on foreigners, in spite of the fact that with the exception of October, November, and part of December of 2020, foreigners have been completely banned from entering Japan. It's totally illogical, it's totally racist, it's totally xenophobic, and yet it is what it is. So, action steps. So when I was still in Italy, I was thinking about things that I could personally do when I got back, because of course, it's weird. When I'm traveling, I always think about all the things that I'm going to make myself do when I get back and I have nothing to do. And then the moment I get back, my agenda fills up and I don't have any room to do any of these extraneous things. One idea I had is I should write a letter, not an email, a physical letter, because it's a lot. I feel like in this day and age, it's very easy to delete an email, but there's almost a surprise element that comes to receiving a physical letter. I thought, why don't I send a physical letter to the Japanese ambassador in Washington, D.C.? Because essentially, he's the representative of the Japanese government to the people of the United States. Another way to read that, at least using American logic, is that he's accountable to the people of the United States. Now, I haven't done that yet because I've had a lot of other stuff on my plate. In the last video, I mentioned that I had a sickness in my family. My mom has breast cancer, and that's big part of the reason I left Japan and why I'm back in the States for an indefinite period of time. And so I'm dealing with that, and I have all kinds of other things in my life going on. So I haven't had time to do this, but I think that's a great idea. You know, if you don't mind sitting down and putting pen to paper or even typing it out and just printing it out and sending it, find the address of the embassy in your country, find out the name of the ambassador and send them a letter, and just very clearly and as respectfully as possible, explain your situation, explain that, look, Japan is the only G7 country. I mean, at this point, it's not even about students and workers. Every other G7 country has outlined a plan to fully open their borders to vaccinated tourists, okay? Japan still locks out workers and students in spite of that. It's unacceptable. And on that note, I also think those of you in the UK should consider sending a paper letter to Grant Shapps, the transport minister that is apparently coordinating transport and tourism and travel for the G7 during the UK's G7 presidency. You know, they had this meeting the other day where they set up all these high-level agreements that apparently have no bearing in reality and no practical application. But I was thinking to myself the other day, I was like, he's a minister, which means that if he were to want to travel to Japan, he would follow the diplomat's path. He would call up his friends down the street at the embassy in London, bada bing, bada boom, probably wouldn't even have to quarantine. He probably has no idea that people are locked out of Japan. He probably doesn't realize that students are locked out, that workers are locked out. He probably thinks that there's just a quarantine and anyone who's willing to comply with it. He's like the CNN writers who wrote that stupid article. He probably has no idea what's going on. Write him a letter. You know what I'm saying? Those of you who are in Japan, send a letter in English or Japanese to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to the Ministry of Land, Health, and Welfare, to the Immigration Services Agency. You know, one person who I think her contribution to or at least her care and concern for international students has been underrated throughout this is Mori Masako. She is the former justice minister who campaigned really hard for Kishida to become PM, so she obviously has some sort of sway with him. She's posted a lot about the need to reform the border and open the border. Contact her. We need as many allies as we can get. And again, we need to be respectful, but one thing I would caution people from doing too much, I think there's this tendency, particularly among foreigners who live in Japan and who are there for a long time and who have this idea that they're ever going to be accepted as Japanese or members of Japanese society. Spoiler alert, it's never going to happen. Is to be overly deferential and respectful in their minds, but really they're being deferential. They're laying down like a carpet to Japanese customs and Japanese culture and the Japanese system and the Japanese way and hierarchies and caste system. And again, you don't have to be as rough around the edges as I am. Like, for example, I regularly call out Motegi on Twitter. You know, he's a racist. I'm sorry, he's a xenophobe. He doesn't like foreigners unless they are whining and dining him in a foreign country. And I have lots of anecdotal observations and evidence for that, and I'm not shy about saying it. You don't have to be as rough around the edges as me, and in fact, I wouldn't recommend it. But at the same time, being polite and waiting patiently and being deferential and doing things the Japanese way has not gotten us anywhere. You know, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. I think that although there is probably a plan in place behind the scenes, I do think we're going to see an announcement soon. I do think we're going to see movement within the next few weeks or months. In spite of that, we can't continue doing what we're doing, and we can't do nothing at all. So I would recommend writing some letters. If you can't, writing some emails, engaging people on Twitter, staying engaged, staying informed, and yes, staying a little bit mad. You have a right to be mad about this. Many of you have given up years of your life, tens of thousands of dollars or euros or whatever your currency is. You have put your life on hold in order to make Japan a part of your dream, in order for whatever you're going there to do, to make Japan a better country, either in the short term, the medium term, or the long term. You have a right to be angry, and I'm sorry, you do have a right to be in that country at this point, particularly since almost every other country in the world rolls out the red carpet for Japanese travelers. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for today, and I apologize for that little blip in the middle of the video. I hope I'm able to combine these videos and I don't have to re-record and start from the beginning, because I've been drinking this cold brew coffee and I'm a tiny bit jittery right now, and I don't know that I can rattle through that again. But I hope you all are doing well. I'm sorry I didn't make a video in September. I hope that by November we have better news. I mean, I'm really hoping that he doesn't wait until after the general election, as early as it is, because wouldn't that be terrible if there's the general election, he succeeds, and then November cases start ticking up again, and then this whole emergency, sky is falling, masks in your own cars, bullshit starts up again, and then pushes us to the back of the queue again. I don't know. I'm hoping there's an announcement in the next couple weeks. I'm going to be vocal and active and monitoring on Twitter. One other account that I recently discovered, in addition to Davide and Stranded Out Japan, is there's this Korean person. I don't know if they're a man or a woman. Doesn't matter. The New Koku News is their Twitter handle. They're excellent. They post a lot of different articles, and since they're Korean, they post a lot of articles from the Korean media, which I think provides a glimpse into a perspective and an angle and an urgency, given the perpetually turbulent state of affairs and the relations between Japan and Korea. A different perspective that's really helpful. But I hope you all are doing well. I hope you take some action. I hope you stay mad. And I hope I have better news next month. I really do. I hope that all of you can get in soon, and we can just put this behind us, move on, and get back to loving Japan. Because you know what? Part of the reason I am so mad all the time, and I am so engaged, and I am so passionate about this, and I'm never going to stop talking about it, I'm never going to shut up, is that I love Japan. I love Japan with all my heart, and I can't wait to cut this piece of hate out, because I hate feeling this way. So see you next month. Bye.